The day began heavy in the big house, with the sun striking the tiles at an odd angle and the smell of brewed coffee drifting out of the kitchen. The enslaved workers moved quickly through the corridors to get ahead on their tasks, trying not to make unnecessary noise. Baron Rodrigo ran his eyes over the account papers without really seeing the numbers. The night had been bad. Again. He thought of Lucas and felt the same emptiness, as if the entire house were too big for the voice he had never heard. There were no scheduled visits, no doctor, no one else seemed to have a solution. Helena walked by with the bucket, avoiding him and the foreman without lifting her head, but she noticed the weariness in the Baron's steps and understood that this day would not be like the others. Lucas was already awake, sitting on the cold floor of the great room, fiddling with the lobe of his right ear, restless. Helena noticed the gesture from afar and felt her stomach tighten, a spasm that reminded her of her brother Tiago lying on an old mat. The memory didn't come with perfect images, but with sensations: hot skin, sweat, short breathing, stifled crying. She cleaned the window with a damp cloth, and through the slit in the glass watched Lucas stare at the yard like someone searching for a sound that doesn't exist. The boy moved his lips, trying out imitations of words he had never heard. The gesture was automatic, like someone repeating a habit without knowing why. The Baron crossed the room, paused for a second and moved on, avoiding meeting his son's gaze. Foreman Bernardino sensed the mood and kept his comments to himself. The air was heavy, and no one there knew that the explanation lived in the day's simplest detail. When Helena gathered the glasses from the sideboard, she saw Lucas's hand rise to his ear with more force, and his expression grew tense, almost pained. The boy squeezed his eyelids shut for a moment, as if something throbbed inside. She came close enough to assess without drawing attention. In the hallway, the Baron pretended to look for a letter in the office, but slowed his step, curious and worried. He knew that any wrong approach turned into an argument. Bernardino, beside the door, pretended to check a list of provisions. Silence wasn't just the absence of sound, it was an alert that everyone understood in their own way. Helena swallowed hard. She had the feeling that the boy's discomfort wasn't new. It was just the first time everyone had been still enough to notice. The house followed the rhythm of mid-morning, pot on the fire, cloth beating against the banister, water thrown into the courtyard to chase off the dust. Helena settled beside the wooden bench and asked Lucas, with a simple gesture of hand and look, to sit closer to the light. There were no words, no theatrics. He knew her well enough to comply without resistance. The Baron saw the movement and felt an alarm inside his chest, torn between authority and the fear of getting in the way. Bernardino set his jaw, attentive to the unspoken rules. Helena tilted the boy's head carefully, tucked his hair behind his ear, and breathed for 2 seconds before looking. She saw a dark glint in the depths, an irregular reflection. She knew she could be mistaken, but the memory of her brother pushed her forward. Helena understood in that instant that asking permission would ruin the chance she had, not because of the Baron's malice, but because of the time that would be. Lost between doubts and orders, the risk was real. Touching the master's son without authorization meant punishment, and everyone knew it. But the boy was in pain, and the discomfort would get worse. She mentally searched for what she needed: a clean cloth, something to lubricate, a thin rod that wouldn't hurt. Nothing sophisticated, only precision and calm. The Baron stepped back, suspicious of what she intended. Bernardino crossed his arms. Helena stood, went to the kitchen, didn't run so as not to draw attention, and fetched what she remembered would work. When she returned, her heart was pounding, but her hands already had the movement of someone who does what needs to be done. Lucas went still when Helena rested her hand on his shoulder, firm enough to give security without squeezing. His body was warm, and his fingers trembled in a nearly imperceptible way. Helena wrapped the cloth, moistened with oil, and tested the flexibility on the edge of the table. There was no rush in her motion. Any sudden movement would turn care into injury. She positioned the boy's head so the light would fall inside his ear. The Baron couldn't help himself and came 2 steps closer, stopping before the imaginary line that separated authority and trust. Bernardino kept his gaze fixed, ready to intervene if anything spun out of control. The room felt smaller, and everything narrowed to that dark point that no one there, except Helena, truly recognized. The tip of the cloth touched the edge of the ear canal, and Lucas clenched his jaw, surprised by the contact. Helena didn't retreat, but she didn't force it either. She kept her breathing steady and made a small rotation, trying to dislodge what was stuck without pushing it further in. The oil did the job of loosening what the years had glued. There was an instant of resistance, a dry catch that revealed the presence of a foreign body. The boy gripped the hem of his own shorts with both hands. Sweat beaded on his nose, a small sign. The Baron noticed that made him flex his fingers, tense. Bernardino furrowed his brow. Helena continued, millimeter by millimeter, until she felt it give. When it came out, the object looked smaller than the weight it had caused for so long. Dark, damp, with the texture that betrays a life that shouldn't be there. Helena brought it to her palm, still with the cloth, and kept it away from Lucas's face so as not to frighten him further. The Baron leaned in, saw it, and didn't react right away. His thoughts ran through years of doctors, bills paid, trips, promises, and stopped at the simplest fact: no one had looked properly. Bernardino stepped back half a pace, enough to show astonishment without admitting fault. The room felt strange, as if the air had a different weight. Lucas blinked slowly, and his face traced a new confusion, unlike the usual. Something was arriving from the outside in, and he had no reference for it. The boy fainted without drama, like someone switching off a light. In a room, his body went limp in Helena's arms, who had already expected a reaction of that kind. It was more exhaustion than fright. The Baron lunged instinctively, but stopped so as not to interfere with the support for the head. Bernardino brought water in a mechanical movement, useful and silent. Helena laid the boy on the cold floor, kept his head turned to the side, and waited for the body to reorganize what it had never experienced. Time in there seemed to lose its rhythm, caught between fear and hope. There was no shouting, no orders, only waiting, and in the waiting the mute certainty that that day would not be forgotten by anyone in that house. Lucas opened his eyes like someone returning from a place without weight and without image. First he stared at the ceiling, then he turned his face to the window. The sound of wind passing through the leaves outside entered him as something new and at the same time obvious. His chest rose in a short, trembling sigh. The Baron noticed the change in his son's eyes and couldn't maintain his iron posture. His throat tightened. Helena watched the transition, didn't reach for a word, didn't reach for a smile. The boy moved his lips, still without control, and let out a hoarse, experimental sound. It wasn't loud nor beautiful, but it was sound, and everyone understood that the house had just changed. The Baron only approached when he was sure that Lucas was conscious. His breathing was fast but steady. The boy raised his hand to his ear, now without pain, and seemed to notice something different in his own body, as if the world had acquired a new dimension. The father watched, unsure how to act, driven by the fear of making any movement that might shatter the moment. Helena remained beside him, motionless, guarding the space the child needed to understand what was happening. Silence was no longer the same. It was no longer absence, but pause. The room felt smaller, concentrated on that event. Even Bernardino, used to controlling everything by force, kept quiet, seized by a doubt he would never admit aloud. The word came out of Lucas like a hesitant sound, still rough, almost a thud caught in his throat. There was no clarity in the pronunciation, but the meaning was unmistakable. The Baron stopped as if the floor had vanished for a second. He leaned forward without realizing he was moving. Helena looked at the boy with the serenity of someone who recognizes a miracle not by its grandiosity, but by the simplicity it carries. Bernardino averted his eyes as if he had witnessed something he shouldn't have seen. The moment stretched out, with no one knowing what to say, because any word would be too small. Something had been returned to the world, and the house still didn't know how to absorb it. The Baron knelt beside his son, a gesture that contradicted the posture he always kept in front of others. He touched the boy's shoulder carefully, as if learning to be a father in that moment. Lucas lifted his face, still stunned by the sensory avalanche. The room's light seemed clearer, the sound of the wind livelier, other people's breathing more present. Helena took a step back, not to withdraw, but so that the space between father and son could exist without interference. Bernardino watched the scene, like someone trying to understand where the error lay in what he had believed immutable. Everything was quiet, but there was no silence anymore. There was presence. The impact of what had happened didn't dissipate quickly. The Baron ran a hand over his face, trying to maintain the emotional control he had sustained for years. Lucas felt out the world with small movements, each gesture guided by surprise. He followed sounds that had never existed for him before, like the drag of a cloth on the floor or the distant slam of a door. Helena perceived everything with the precision of someone who recognizes subtle signs. Bernardino remained standing at the entrance, unable to interrupt. There were no adequate words to explain the change. Each in their own way was trying to reorganize reality from that moment on. The Baron stood up slowly and looked at Helena without haste, as if he needed to grasp something bigger than the immediate situation. There were questions he could ask, but none of them would make any difference now. The truth was before him in a way so clear that any sentence would be redundant. He remembered all the doctors who had crossed his door, the costly promises, the endless consultations. None of them had seen what was there. Helena had seen it, not because she possessed formal knowledge, but because she had looked closely. The recognition was not spoken, but it filled the space between them with absolute clarity. Helena, however, was not seeking approval. Her eyes were fixed on Lucas, assessing whether the fainting had left any dangerous physical effects. She knew the body could react in unpredictable ways to changes this intense. The boy seemed well, only disoriented. The Baron took a deep breath, and it was the first in years that didn't carry despair. Bernardino, accustomed to reading behaviors, understood that something had shifted in the house's invisible hierarchy. It wasn't a threat, nor a violent rupture. It was a displacement, a new, silent order. The clatter of cutlery coming from the kitchen, which, until that moment, had always been only a distant vibration for Lucas, now arrived with too much volume. He started. Frightened by the intensity, Helena approached calmly and placed her hand over the boy's chest to steady him, guiding his breathing without words. The Baron watched, understanding that adaptation couldn't be forced. Everything would be gradual on the child's time. Bernardino let out the breath he had been holding without realizing it. The world would now demand patience, and no one there was used to that pace. The news didn't spread through the house like an immediate rumor. No one spoke loudly. No one ran. The enslaved people passing through the corridor merely sensed a different atmosphere, lighter and denser at the same time, hard to explain. Lucas walked to the window and stood watching the movement of the leaves in the yard, as if that were the most important spectacle in the world. Helena gathered the used utensils and put them away as if it were an intimate ritual. The Baron remained still, absorbing. Bernardino withdrew without asking for instructions, for the first time, unsure of what to do to maintain routine. The afternoon advanced, but the day seemed unwilling to end. Later, when the house was silent again, now a living silence full of things rearranging, the Baron called Helena. He didn't speak of debt, gratitude, or obligation. He simply conveyed a decision. Helena stood motionless for a few seconds, trying to grasp the scope of it. The foreman, informed afterward, took time to believe it. The letter of manumission was written without ceremony, without speeches, without important witnesses. There was no celebration, only a concrete gesture that changed everything. Helena did not leave, not because she felt bound, but because there was something to continue there. Lucas, now facing a world he needed to learn from scratch, would have in her the safest point of reference. The Baron didn't ask for explanations, didn't condition her staying on anything. The big house seemed to listen now. The pain that had previously spread through the walls seemed to have retreated to distant places. Nothing that happened that day was announced in the square, told to the neighbors, or recorded in celebrations. What transformed there was silent, deep, and irreversible, and none of the three would ever see the world the same way again. In the days that followed, Lucas's adjustment to sound was an unstable process. He startled at noises that were trivial to others, the slam of a door, a cup hitting the floor, the distant bark of a dog on the plantation. The body reacted first with jolts, rapid breathing, wide eyes. Then curiosity came, slower, as if the world had to be interpreted piece by piece. Helena accompanied each reaction, adjusting the environment so as not to overwhelm him. The Baron watched, without interfering, but always present. The entire house had to relearn how to exist around the boy. It was as if everyone were participating in a silent rebirth that demanded constant care. The yard became the safest space for Lucas. The wind, passing through the leaves, seemed gentler there, diffused in the open air. He sat near the garden and watched the movement of shadows on the ground, trying to associate what he saw with what he could now hear. Helena stayed nearby without saying anything. There was no need for words at the beginning. Gestures and presence were enough. The Baron every so often approached but kept a respectful distance, as if learning to know his own son for the first time. The relationship among the three had no name, but it had a shape, built-in routine. The change in the house did not go unnoticed by the other enslaved people. They saw the small alterations, the way the Baron showed up more in spaces where he previously only sent representatives, the way Helena walked without lowering her head, the careful treatment of the boy. Bernardino watched as well. He understood that the transformation wasn't temporary. Something larger was reorganizing, and that unsettled the structure of everything. But, contrary to what might be expected, there was no open resistance. The event that all had witnessed, even without fully understanding it, left a mark no one dared contradict. The Baron began to revise his habits without announcing changes. He started accompanying the work in the fields with a different posture, no longer as surveillance, but as responsibility. He observed weariness, food, the forced pace. He didn't speak of kindness or repentance. He simply altered practical decisions. Bernardino received direct instructions to reduce punishments and reorganize schedules. The foreman found it strange at first, but complied. The house and plantation operated under a new, invisible balance. It wasn't sudden benevolence, but a realignment triggered by an experience that dismantled old certainties. Helena changed as well, but in a more intimate way. She slept better, breathed without the constant pressure of watchfulness, and did her work with the same dedication as before, but without fear of being noticed. Her expression carried less rigidity. The weight she had borne since her brother's death seemed to have found some place to settle. Caring for Lucas wasn't an obligation, but continuity, as if she were finally finishing something that time had interrupted too early. She did not expect recognition. She simply remained. Lucas began to make sounds more often. They weren't full words, but attempts, approximations, new ways of existing in space. The house, which had once molded, itself to his absolute silence, now learned to live with small noises, short laughs, irregular vocalizations, heavy breaths when he was moved. The Baron grew used to staying nearby when he could, watching these moments like someone observing something precious and fragile. There was no more rush in his posture, nor desperation, only presence. That was a gesture he had never exercised before. Everyday objects also took on new meaning for Lucas. The sound of water filling a bucket, the creak of a chair being moved, the dry thud of stacked firewood in the yard, all of it seemed fascinating to him. He approached cautiously, observed the movement, touched the object, backed away, and came back. Helena kept the environment safe, ensuring nothing was too intense. The Baron understood that teaching his son to hear wouldn't involve only words, but teaching the boy to feel safe in the face of the world. It was a shared learning in which everyone would need to unlearn something before learning. Anew, Foreman Bernardino, although respectful of orders, carried internal doubts. The change he had witnessed had shaken values he had assumed as absolute to survive in his role. He avoided speaking about it, but he looked at Helena differently now, with an eye that recognized competence and not merely subservience. He also watched the Baron and perceived that there was no theatrical repentance, no speech to please anyone. The transformation was silent but real. Even so, out of habit, Bernardino remained vigilant. Changes to him signified risks. The plantation began to feel the effects of the new posture. The enslaved workers labored with more rhythm and less fear, and paradoxically, productivity increased. The absence of severe punishments reduced tensions that had previously corroded the daily dynamic. Some were surprised to realize it was possible to do the same work without the constant sense of threat. Others took time to trust. The change didn't erase old wounds, but it made room for them to scar over. There was no celebration, no speech of collective liberation, only a slow and steady reorganization. Lucas came to recognize the sound of his own name, even if he still couldn't pronounce it clearly. When Helena called him, he turned. When the Baron spoke, the boy watched the articulation of his lips closely, as if trying to match what he saw to what he now heard. Sound still arrived heavy, confused, too mixed, but it was there, and that was everything. Seeing his son respond to the world, the Baron found a serenity he had never experienced. It wasn't euphoria, it was understanding. The house that had once carried an echo of pain now breathed. Over time, Helena began teaching Lucas small associations between sounds and objects. A cup set on the table, the noise of a door opening, the whistle of the wind cutting under the roof's eaves. The boy observed everything with deep concentration, as if each sound were a piece that needed to fit into the right shape of the world. There was no rush in his gestures, nor in his gaze, nor in his breathing. Learning happened at the rhythm of sensations. The Baron watched from a distance, still surprised that love could be a form of knowledge. The house remained quiet, but not empty. It was an inhabited silence. The garden became the principal space of coexistence for the three of them. There, the sound of leaves dragged by the wind was constant but gentle. Lucas liked to sit on the ground, feeling the vibration of the damp earth under his hands. Helena brought flowers or seeds for him to smell, touch, compare. The Baron watched, standing, leaning against a pillar of the veranda. He didn't try to participate directly, but he was there, present. There were no speeches or explanations about what they were doing. It was simply living together, a new routine that sustained itself effortlessly. The transformation wasn't in what was said, but in what was lived. Bernardino continued fulfilling his tasks, but the way he moved around the property had changed. He no longer spoke in the same hard tone as before. He realized that control no longer came from fear, but from organization. The house seemed to function more fluidly, as if something that had always been tense had finally relaxed. Not everything was simple. Some people resisted in silence. Deep changes aren't absorbed overnight, but the expected confrontations never came. What had established itself there was stronger than any individual. Resistance. The Baron didn't speak of religion, faith, or miracle, but there was something in his face that made it clear he had been pierced by something he could not explain. He didn't try to justify decisions. He simply made them. Helena's letter of manumission remained kept in a safe place, not as a symbol of freedom that required departure, but as a guarantee there would never be a return to what had existed before. Her freedom was now present in her gestures, in her posture, in the way she looked at the space around her. It was a silence full of dignity, and everyone perceived it. Some nights, Lucas woke frightened by sounds he still didn't know how to identify. Footsteps in the hallway, windows banging in the wind, animals in the fields. Helena was the one who went to him because the boy felt more comfortable that way. She didn't speak, didn't explain, just stayed beside him until his body calmed down. The Baron woke as well, but remained at the door, watching. He understood that he couldn't force presence. Learning to be a father also required silence. The big house, which had once seemed too large, was now filled with small, constant presences. The loneliness of that space had lost its strength. As the weeks passed, Lucas began trying to imitate words. They came out halting, arrhythmic, sometimes almost unrecognizable. But each attempt was received with patience. Helena simply watched and smiled when necessary. The Baron let slip discreet emotional reactions, like a sigh or a contained smile. There was no need to encourage with euphoria. The gesture itself was big enough. Words were not the final goal, but a path. Sound was finally present, and that was enough. Helena began to transform on the inside as well. The old pain she carried for her brother was no longer a crushing weight. Now it was a memory that guided but didn't bind. The care she dedicated to Lucas wasn't forced reparation, but living continuity. The boy brought her a kind of peace that didn't come from the absence of suffering, but from understanding what she could do with it. The house recognized her differently, not as a servant nor as a symbol, but as an essential presence. The Baron, in turn, began to observe the world around him with different eyes. He realized that the wealth he had accumulated had no value if it couldn't mean something beyond the mere maintenance of power. There was no political speech or intention of grand transformation, only daily choices made with a different awareness. This was reflected in the fields, in the division of labor, in the way he spoke to people. The change was practical and silent, and for that very reason, profound. None of it spread beyond the property's boundaries. There was no announcement, no story told in the square, no official record. The event that transformed that house didn't become legend or lesson. It remained there, between those walls, among those people. Those who lived it understood. Those who didn't would never know. There was no proof to be shown. The transformation lay in what was not said, and in what became permanent even without being told. Over time, the memory of the day when everything changed no longer needed to be recalled in words. It was in the way Lucas ran through the garden, hearing his own laughter. It was in the way Helena walked lightly, unafraid of being seen. It was in the Baron's gaze, now less hardened, less distant from himself. Nothing extraordinary happened anymore. Life went on, but it went on differently. And no one in that house, not even the wind passing through the windows, could remember how it had been before.